Professor Veselin Vukotic, Rector of UDG, leaders of the Montenegro Academy of Science, faculty members, students, and my young friends who are present on this occasion. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person for very practical reasons, but I'm really happy to be given this opportunity to say a few words to you. Let me at the outset compliment the Rector of the University for having established the Center for Climate Change, Natural Resources and Energy at the university. This happened after a brief interaction I had with him and his faculty, and I was really delighted and very impressed with the speed at which he took a decision. But I think we have a long way to go, and I want to raise a few issues right at the outset, which I hope will be taken as words of very productive, which I hope will be taken as words of positive advice, because I'm a well-wisher. I feel very deeply connected with this center and the university, and I would like to see it flourish and reach a level of global eminence, which gives you a lot of glory in the institution and which provides a major benefit to humanity. What I would say is that if you look at the subjects of climate change, natural resources and energy, yes, of course, they have to be rooted in local initiatives, local priorities, but they are essentially global problems. And I think, therefore, if the center has to do justice to the theme of what it has been set up to do, then clearly you must have a global vision. I'm very happy that my suggestion for setting up a steering committee and the names of distinguished professionals who are to be members of this steering committee was accepted by the rector of the university. But I would like to submit that if you really want to tap the expertise of these people, they are very eminent, busy people, then you have to set aside some resources. And if you were to provide those resources, I can assure you the value of what you would receive by way of advice and the value that it would provide to the growth and development of your center would far outweigh any expenses that you incur. What I want to say is that climate change is a very serious reality and a challenge that clearly is the defining challenge of this century. It's unfortunate that the President of the US has taken the step of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but I don't think that should in any way discourage or deter the rest of the world. If anything, I would say that a center like the CCNRE really now has an enormous role to play, not only in Montenegro, but also in the Balkan region and all of Europe. And Europe now really has to take the lead. So therefore, I would suggest that the small beginning that you have made should really make into a flourishing future. I want to tell you a few things about the findings of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, which I had the privilege of chairing for 13 years. Climate change is resulting in very serious impact, and these will become progressively worse. Sea level rise is a major threat. Just to give you a statistic, there are 250 million people across the globe who live barely within 50 kilometers of the coastline. You are aware that for Montenegro, your beaches, your coastlines are really the most attractive sources of tourism. And therefore, if these were to be affected, if these were to be the result, if these were to be overrun by sea level rise, then clearly this major asset that you have will be lost for all time to come. Because sea level rise is an irreversible change. And in fact, it will continue far beyond this century, even if we bring down emissions of greenhouse gases. So therefore, to adapt to the impacts of climate change, particularly in the case of sea level rise, is a challenge that Montenegro has to face. I would like to submit that as far as this center is concerned, it must not only provide learning, but it must also ensure that projects are implemented in a way that they become success stories, they become a basis for demonstration by which others can emulate what is experienced and achieved at UDG itself. It is for this reason that I had proposed in November last year that the POP movement, which I launched last year on Earth Day, POP stands for Protect Our Planet, should be launched in UDG. And perhaps UDG could take the lead in ensuring that the POP movement becomes a reality across at least the Balkan region. I have been in a dialogue with some of the students, but I would request the rector to really give it a push, involve the students, and I assure you, this will result in win-win outcomes. Because the first thing that students can do is to work with the guidance of the faculty in reducing the energy bill of the university. And that can be done without sacrificing comfort. There are so many steps that can be taken, both in respect of technological change and in respect of behavioral and lifestyle changes that could benefit everybody. You reduce the energy bill for the university, you provide a new inspiration to the students to do these things, not only in their homes and communities, but for society at large. So mitigation is really a major challenge. And I would say that natural resources and energy are connected with the issue of climate change, because climate change is affecting all forms of natural resources. The threat to biodiversity loss, which has already taken place in several areas, is something that has to be reduced by mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases and, of course, to the extent possible, adapting to these impacts. If you look at fish stock, they are going to migrate. They have already started migrating as a result of acidification of the ocean, as a result of warming of the ocean. There are parts of the world which had fish stock that provided an enormous amount of wealth and food security for the population that were dependent on it. Those fish stocks are now moving to other areas because of climate change. Biodiversity is being affected in the form of plant life as well. I can tell you from my own experience in India, apples which grew at a certain altitude in our mountains are now growing at a much higher altitude, simply because the climate has changed and they cannot grow in the lower reaches. I want to also tell you about the impacts of climate change on agriculture. Most of the staple crops that human beings consume are being affected as a result of the negative impacts of climate change on agriculture. So overall, I think climate change is not only an ecological problem, it's a problem that has economic consequences. And I think the new center must look at both aspects, ecological as well as economic, in terms of the implications of climate change, the impacts on natural resources, and what can be done, particularly by bringing about a transition in the sources of energy that we use. It's now obvious that the faster we move away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, which are going to be low or no carbon in terms of emissions, the better it would be. Just to give you a figure, the IPCC fifth assessment report clearly specified that if we want to keep temperature increase by the end of the century to below 2 degrees Celsius, then clearly by 2050, we need a reduction of emissions of 40 to 70% relative to levels that existed in 2010. And by the end of the century, we will have to move to a level whereby emissions are either zero or negative. Now you would ask, how can you have negative emissions? Well, firstly, we need much greater forestation. We need much greater forest cover across the globe. We need to do away completely with deforestation. And I think we'll also have to come up with technologies for carbon capture and storage. Particularly bioenergy and carbon capture and storage will have to go hand in hand. And why should we do that? Because today we have only one way to move ahead, and that is to ensure that this planet, which is the only home that we have, is protected in a manner that its ecosystems are not damaged and destroyed. If you look at some of the coral reefs across the globe, they are in a state which is really pathetic. as a result of climate change. The oceans are acidifying. 30% of the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since the beginning of industrialization has gone into the oceans, and that has led to very serious acidification. I also want to mention to you that we have to worry about the impacts on human health, because extreme events such as heat waves, extreme precipitation events, extreme sea level rise related events are all going to become more severe, more intense, and more frequent. So therefore, we have to make sure that we don't allow this world to face risks that are going to be unbearable, to which there are no measures by which we can adapt. And already you find floods, you find droughts, you find heat waves. You're aware of the heat wave that took place in and around Paris in 2003, which led to tens of thousands of deaths. Now that's the kind of occurrence which will happen more frequently, more intensely in the future. And we cannot allow future generations in particular to bear the consequences of our inaction. And therefore, what we really need to do firstly is to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, move to low carbon and zero carbon sources of energy, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. There is an urgency in doing this, and I will give you one statistic. You see, if let us say at the beginning of industrialization, we were in a position to calculate how much of carbon dioxide emissions could be allowed to see that the temperature increase by the end of the 21st century does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Well, then we would have come up with an estimate of 2,900 gigatons of CO2 in the year when industrialization began, that means in the middle of the 19th century. Now, as it happened, by 2011, we had already consumed 1,900 gigatons of this budget. And today, perhaps, it's somewhere between 2,000 and 2,100 gigatons. So what we have left as part of this budget, if we want to ensure that temperature increase doesn't exceed 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, what we have left is barely 800 or 750 gigatons. Now this will go in no time at all, because let me give you another set of numbers. In the year 2000, the total emissions of greenhouse gases in the world were 39 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That means all the gases put together. By 2010, this number had gone up to 49 gigatons. In other words, we have added 1 gigaton per year during this 10-year period. We have to change this. I think by 2020, we have to make sure that the emissions of greenhouse gases peak and start coming down very rapidly after that. And this, to my mind, gives the new center an enormous challenge. And I think one of the big challenges you have is to see that you generate enough resources from the European Commission, from foundations, and from other sources of financial support. But that will only happen if you're able to come up with quality thinking, quality plans, quality proposals that merit being supported by these sources. And that is where I believe the Rector's decision to set up a steering committee was a very good one. But if that steering committee is not activated, then I'm sorry, you've lost that resource. So I would submit that both with the internal members of the steering committee and the excellent talent that we have from outside, you can really bring about guidance, you can bring about direction for the center, and I'd like to wish you all the best. In closing, let me say that if you want me later in the afternoon, I may be able to join you by Skype, and you can let me know if you want me to do that and at what time, possibly after 3 p.m. when you're closing. If you want me to be part of the closing session, it would be my privilege and pleasure to do so. So I wish you all the best. I hope you have a very productive day, and at the end of it, you not only create a roadmap for building up the new center that you have set up, but also ensuring that it becomes a beehive of activity, a source of inspiration and intellectual support for the whole world. My own vision, if I can share it with you, although I'm not part of the university, is to see that this center becomes a global resource. And if there's anything I can do to help in that regard, I would regard that, I would treat that as a great privilege. Thank you very much.